Welcome back, everyone. It is a pleasure having you here. We are continuing our series on World War One, and the first session that was covering the Fisher thesis for the origins of the First World War. Uh, this is a little different, and it has been titled "The Road to World War One." If you ask me, as a student of history, what caused this greatest event of 20th century, or even if you take my words, it is something which has changed the way world was for centuries. The most common explanation that comes to you is a shot that was fired in Sarajevo. The Princip who assassinated the Archduke, and that led to the war. Well, it was an incident out of many incidents that makes up the road to this great tragedy the world saw. In this session, we have tried to cover a few of the notable events. I again say a few because it is a long list and it's such complex matter that one has to go deep into it. However, we will try to summarize most of them in this episode. So, we move forward with our lecture. So, we start with the Congress of Vienna that took place in the aftermath of Napoleonic era, and the conquest he led, and entire Europe was put to the war, and finally it ended at the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon forces were defeated. So it was important to lay down the principles of how the Europe would behave for the coming century or so. However, if you see closely the series commencing from 1814 till 1814, that was the series of diplomatic conferences. It only took 100 years for the entire Europe to go for war again, and it was more lethal this time around. Why I would say that? What made First World War so lethal was that in uh, in Napoleon conquest, it was him, his ambitions to rule the world, whereas most of the other parties they were on the defending mode. Especially if you see Russia, like Napoleon invaded Russia, and then based on that, if they were forced to defend, and then the retreat of Napoleon army from Russia all the way up to Paris, where the final declaration was signed. Uh, the case of World War One was very different because at that time the ambitions were running not only in one power but almost all the imperial power, they were fighting for one way or the other. So that's why it made it so lethal, and it went on for 5 years in the most brutal manner. This conference was primarily to settle a new understanding between the great powers of Europe, and what we term as the balance of power, and it is maintained uh, through guarantees by the great powers, which includes Britain, Prussia, Austro-Hungary, and Russia, in the shape of sphere of influences, which have other smaller nations, and they live under their safety and their authority, and this maintains the power. uh, One of the most important character of this entire Congress was a statesman from Austria, when Metternich, and he was and he is still seen as the architect of this entire setup. However, as we will move forward, we'll see the complication it caused and how this entire equilibrium, the balance of power was disturbed, which led to the Great War. And from French, because they were the aggressor prior to this Congress, whatever was won by Napoleon through conquest, that was spread between the remaining great powers, the victors, led by the British, the Russian, the Prussians, and the Austro-Hungarians. And there was another understanding that prior to the rise of the Napoleon, the French imperial alignment, it went through an entire upheaval, a very bloody upheaval in the form of French Revolution. So that gave rise to a few important attributes. Among them, it was the call for republicanism, people's power, liberalism, that is freedom of speech, association, and above it, the revolutionary instincts in terms of the nationalism. So this Congress in somehow was envisioned to suppress these powers as well. And my understanding, one of the causes which led to the demise of this system uh, in a very short time, 100 years when the Great War started, but the demise started pretty early. It was that these attributes which were irreversible, they were of the view that they can reverse it, but that just wasn't the case. Treaty of London basically pertains to the neutrality of Belgium, which will be a central focus when we move to the next century and Germany goes to war with France and violates this neutrality. This was guaranteed in 1839, and the guarantees, among other, included Austria-Hungary, France, Germany itself, Netherlands, Russia, and the British Empire. While Belgium was declared neutral, and its German-speaking regions, which is Luxembourg, it became independent out of this treaty. While the concept of Europe that we reviewed stood for the balance of power, by 1861 a new player emerged, that was Italy. This is the unification of Italy, and there were prior to this many political and social movement that were going on in the entire region, and finally it ended with unification. This included a lot of regions, including Milan, San Marco, Sicily, the Roman Republic, and other regions. And by 1871, Rome was also brought under this affair, which became the capital. And Victor Emmanuel, he was declared the King of Italy. Another important figure of this unification was Camillo Benso, and this showed that unlike the vision seen just around half a century ago, less than half a century ago, uh, things were changing very rapidly. Social movement, political movement, they were there, and same would emerge in the shape of nationalist movements. In 1871, another player which was already there in the shape of Prussia, uh, it became more organized and became one of the most significant industrial, military, and economical hub for the Europe, and that was through the unification of Germany. Uh, the German Empire came into being, which remained till the end of the First World War, and Kaiser Wilhelm I was uh, declared the king, of the new empire till his abdication in 1980. And this will now somehow shape the remaining political scenario of Europe, because it became a very significant player, one of the biggest industrial power. Then it will join the arms race as well. So Berlin was declared capital, and another prominent statesman, Otto von Bismarck, he was assigned the role of the chancellor. In all, it was around 25 states that made up the newly formed Empire of Germany. Its population was 41 million, which by the start of the First World War had become 68 million. And this is seen as a very significant event, because right at the heart of Europe, France to one side, Austro-Hungary to the other side, Britain just across the English Channel, and the Russian Empire, a new force emerged with a lot of ambition that we will discuss as we will move on. By 1879, the system of alliances, which played one of the most vital role, being a secret web knitted by the empires themselves, it was starting to form up. So the one significant, also known as the Dual Alliance of 1879, was between the newly formed German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was on its downside at that time. And the common threat they both perceived was Russia. And with reference to the France, they both said in case of an attack to any of the two parties, the other side will remain neutral. Bismarck has been considered as the architect of this entire period of diplomacy, balancing the power game of entire Europe, while at the same time he was making inroads for German in the global map, being a newly emerged empire, while not upsetting the balance of power which remained. That was his art of diplomacy. And for that, this alliance primarily was that Russia, it will act as a deterrence, that it cannot afford two-front war because of Germany and Austro-Hungary entering into an alliance. German overall was led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, while Austro-Hungary was ruled by Franz Joseph. And this will further enhance in 1882 with Italy joining the alliance, then became the Triple Alliance. And prior to that, what pushed Italy, or what served as a catalyst to this alliance, was Russian ambitions in the Balkans. It was making inroads at the cost of the Ottomans, and this was something which both of these parties wanted to keep in check. So, the system of alliance, which has been termed as one of the leading cause of the Great War, the distrust between the imperial powers, secretly joining hands, adding insecurity to the other parties. One of the prime example is the Triple Alliance, which was formed in 1882. This included Germany and Austro-Hungary, which were already in alliance, and Italy joined in. And Italy, it had a conflict with the French Empire over Africa, and the loss pushed it into fear and insecurity, and it joined the alliance. And this alliance will remain till 1915. So basically now the alignment for the First World War is set by This uh, this alliance is pretty interesting as we will review it. Like in case of France, they all were commonly tied, but if Russia was to start a war with with Germany or Austro-Hungary, in that case, as per this pact, Italy will remain neutral. And that was basically because when it came to Balkan, the Austro-Hungary and Italy, they themselves were at war with each other, which will become the hotbed. Till 1919, the main draft of this alliance, this treaty, it remained a secret. This shows how difficult the diplomacy or complex the diplomacy was at that time. And within this alliance lifeline, which ended in 1915, there was a secret arrangement between Italy and France because they had found somehow understanding that in case of French war with any of the other two parties, Italy will somehow remain neutral. So it was a mess in itself, and this will be the case in other episodes as we move on. On the European stage by 1888, a new figure emerges, which is Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Now, he is very interesting as we move to the start of the First World War, and in the central picture, he's seen with the Russian Emperor Nicholas II. So, his rise was a little unprecedented because it is known as the year of three emperors. His grandfather, his father, they both passed during a very short span of some 90 years, and he was somehow ill prepared, very ambitious. Even if you go back to his birth, that's also a very interesting debate. It was considering the medical advancement of that time, which was pretty immature. His birth was quite complicated, and somewhat owing to these complications, he had both physical and psychological limitations. Decision in haste, lack of concentration towards the matter, this kept on impacting his personality, and unfortunately, as the heir to the throne, this really translated into the fate of millions who got tangled up in this great war. So, firstly, after assuming charge by 1890, he dismissed the pillar of German entire foreign policy, that was Bismarck. He was dismissed, and with this, Bismarck's legacy or his masterpiece, that was the balance of power in Europe, that was disturbed, and the reason was his ambitions to make Germany not a secondary but the leading power, the great power of Europe. And when you are looking for a space, it has to be like what they call it, zero sum game. If you are gaining, somebody else is losing, and in this case, who was losing? The already established power. Britain one side, France on other side, the Russians. So it was definitely something. His ambitions had to be at the cost of somebody else. So his era was quite interesting. By 1918, when the war in terms of Germany was coming to an end because of huge losses on the Western Front, he abdicated and later went on exile, where he lived in Holland till 1941 at the time of his death. And Even Holland was under, at that time, Nazis occupation. He was buried there. In terms of his legacy, uh, hostility, he compromised on nothing when it comes to diplomacy. It was a solo flight. Uh, his legacy in terms of transforming the British, transforming the German Navy into the leading naval power was itself towards a global dominance. As they say, he who controls the sea controls the land. So his ambitions were clearly that he was heading for not only Europe dominance but towards the regions which are dominated by Europe in terms of its colonies. So for that, his highly aggressive naval build-up rang alarm bells all across Europe. And however, uh, as per the German perspective, he gave them a very, very special place by building up the navy, the land force, and the industrial might. And they took some pretty bold decisions, and they were by the scale of diplomacy very confrontationist. Like, for instance, if you see uh, uh, his policy was in terms of 1914 by aligning itself to Austro-Hungary post assassination of the Archduke. That primarily tangled up the powers into this conflict. Otherwise, it would have been, as per my understanding, it would have been a local between Austro-Hungary and Serbia. That would have been limited to that, or to somehow Russians to a smaller extent coming into the defense of that Slav sentiments. But his declaration basically brought everyone into the war. Then, uh, moving further, negating the neutrality of Belgium to attack France, that was also one of the causes. But if you go back, in Morocco crisis, uh, his role and towards British, especially not only naval, but his inroads into the Persian area of influence of Britain by building a rail through Baghdad. That was something which put them at very odd. But what it happened, what it caused for Germany was a state of isolation. It had to rely on Austro-Hungary and Ottoman, both powers which were totally, they were no match. They were already on a declining side, and this choice of wrong allies costed, in terms of the battlefield, Germany the war. One tragic event which is somehow uh, sidelined, although I feel it would have changed the fate of the entire Balkan, and that was the suicide of the heir to the throne uh, at that time. From his birth, the only son of Franz Joseph I of Austro-Hungary, Rudolph. He was 31 year old, lived from 1858 till 89. He committed suicide, and very, very mysterious, very, very interesting character. And he, his suicide itself is a mystery in itself. It was made through a suicide pact with his lady that was Mary Westera. She was merely 18 years old, something which was not accepted by her family. She was a baroness as well, but Rudolph was already married. He was already married, and they were into an affair. And Unlike what popular perception would become, that it was something which was related to emotions, this guy was at this age a revolutionary. A revolutionary in this sense that at the age of 23 in 1881, his father, they were it's so odd that he had to be sidelined from all the state affairs because he was well versed, he had traveled, and he had a lot of liberal ideas towards dealing with the nationalities living within the sphere of Austro-Hungary, and his dislike of especially imperialist culture, referring to the Russian Empire. He was not in favor of that, and he was influenced by a journalist, Martis Seps, and his ideas. He was to write anonymously to his paper, and he was also a very keen traveler. He had published two books on his travels, which are sort of encyclopedia. And his mother, in 1898, he was also assassinated in Switzerland. So we will cover this family, this house in detail. So his demise, and then later Franz Joseph brother, his crowning, somehow that, as per my understanding, was the biggest tragedy for the region. A person of his ideas, he would have given or understood the nationalism and the ideas, the second wave of Renaissance in a better manner, and that would have avoided the entire war. Moving further into the complex system of alliance, a misjudgment on behalf of the German king Wilhelm II. Post he moved away from the Bismarck policy of maintaining balance of power and alliances. Uh, by 1890, Germany and Russia had a mutual treaty which is referred to as a reinsurance treaty of no hostility toward each other. The new king, in after resuming rule in 1888, he let it expire, and that was basically to show that there is no bound to his ambitions. Now, as this expired, so Russia definitely failed Austro-Hungary and Germany as well. France was already at a hard place, having conceded so much to the newly formed Germany that it reached out, and a secret treaty was formed that in case of any hostility from other powers, these both will stand with each other. So much so that France had agreed to extend up to 8 lakh, 0.8 million troops. Uh, Russia actually had pledged 0.8 million troops to France if it is threatened or it goes to war against Germany. And in the same manner, France had pledged almost 1.3 million troops if uh, Russians are threatened or they go at war with one of the great powers. So this shows how the political alignment was changing. Now, one important thing that will be seen when we lead to the First World War is the future plan, the two-front war. And if this alliance had not been formed and the Germans had renewed reinsurance treaty with Russia, it would have walked out of this problem. And for that, by 1914, it was faced with a two front, France on one side, Russia on the other side. So now by 1898, we move to the armed race. That is, that war was imminent. That was what was on the mind of the empires and their rulers, the kings. So the case of German Naval Law 1898, as it is referred, that basically starts the new chapter into Germans' ambition. There is a common phrase that we refer, it wants a place at the sun, and the sun. And the gentleman in the middle, Foreign Secretary Benhard, I quote his word. In one word, we wish to throw no one in shadow, but we also demand our place in the sun. And that was the German push to have its sphere of influence at the expense of other. And one of its translation was, if you want to maintain colonies, you have to have if you are looking for unmatched industrial and economical and commercial outreach, it has to be through the sea. And British since long have lived by the phrase, "You controls sea, controls land," so they were the biggest naval might. Now, very interestingly, Wilhelm in his biography quotes that his passion for navy came naturally because he had English blood through his extended family, and as a child he always admired British ships, its navy, and as a king now he possesses his own. That was his keenness to navy, but such a aggressive maneuver definitely put British into a very insecure position, and it started arming itself as well. And this rise of Germany was so unprecedented that in 1889 the British naval policy was two powers standard. This two powers standard refers to that its naval strength should be more than its two closest rivals, which is at that time it was Russia and France. And by 1898, just after 9 years, it was challenged by the rising power of Europe, Germany, by competing directly. We have a very important architect of this policy, and he is known as Admiral Tirpitz on the left, and he was one who primarily championed this theory of battleships, because there was a debate between either it should be a battleship based force or the cruisers, which are easy to maneuver and they have the extended reach to the colonies. But his weight was toward the battleship, thus directly putting Britain into a competition with the Germans. However, when we see the war, it was not the over the sea fleet, which is the battleship envisioned by the Tirpitz, which gave any edge to the Germans. It was rather its U-boat fleet which was most lethal. Now we move to the Russian-Japanese conflict of 1905 that was fought over Manchuria. Russian historical issue remains its access to the warm water ports, and it was looking for an intro into that area, and that put it at odds with the Japanese. There was no match. Russia was there, Japan prior to this was not on the map. And Russians were led by Nicholas II, while Japanese were led by Emperor Meiji. And it was very interesting that initially the Japanese, they'd offered them the ports they were looking for in exchange for their recognition of Japanese having authority over the Manchurian region, which is now modern day Korea. And Russians flatly refused, and they claimed their control over the ports. And just like Pearl Harbor, the Japanese surprised them with an attack on Port Arthur. And by the end of the war, two-thirds of Russian naval fleet was gone. It was primarily a naval battle, and it was ended through Portsmouth Treaty. And the right image, it shows a struggling Russian emperor, a very firm Japanese Emperor Meiji, and in the middle you see Teddy Roosevelt, the US President, negotiating peace, which was only to save the grace of the Russian, because by all military standards they were totally routed. What it reflects otherwise is the changing balance. Russian, the great empire, which rescued the entire Europe from Napoleon, it was by all the Russian military victory which reversed the tide for Napoleon. In less than 100 years, it was brought to its knees by a newly emerging player. Not only it was losing its influence there, its long-held influence in Europe and other regions and colonies. It was also waiting, and new players like Germany, Japanese, they were reaching out. So the entire concept of Vienna, its context, the great powers, it was moving very rapidly now. The age of technology had dawned. On the other hand, this also was the start of the end for the Russian Empire, the Russian Emperor, the tragedy. We might cover the Russian Revolution itself, but the House of Romanov, from there on, there was no reversal. The entire pride of Russia, its empire, its legacy, defeated by Japanese, it was irreversible. Then it was an entire downhill path right till the defeat and later unfortunate assassination of the entire family that we will definitely cover. Now we move to Balkans and annexation of Bosnia, and it's a very interesting story. It had been under the rule of the Ottomans, but as it was vanishing from the map by 1878, it was indirectly handed over to Austria-Hungary. It was sort of a trustee thing, but by 1908, unilaterally, Austro-Hungary, reflecting on its ambition to conquer entire Balkans, it claimed annexation and brought Bosnia Herzegovina into its sphere. Now, predominantly Serbia, right at its doorstep. It was a tragedy for them, and they, along with Russia, seeing Austrian inroads into Balkans and ultimately coming on the doorstep of Russia, they were severely shocked by this expansionism of Austro-Hungary. And if you see this event and then match it to what happened in Sarajevo, which was the assassination of the Archduke, so the seeds were sown here. This is what built up the hate which led to that unfortunate assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, and that's all interlinked. And this was also very upsetting for the entire balance of power, and whatever was agreed between the great powers less than a century ago, it was being tarnished in one way or the other. Morocco crisis, it's a long chain of events, but we will reflect upon 1911. There was a common understanding between the great powers to respect each other's economical interest, while politically French were controlling Morocco. Uh, Somehow in 1911, uh, they persuaded or they forced the Sultan to concede a lot of concessions to other power, and in the context of a rebellion, French troops they started amassing in Morocco, and that was a clear signal that it was going for unilateral control against the treaty. And for that, the Germans, their main station was a port. The German battleships they were dispatched, precisely the Panther class. They were dispatched, and both France and Germany they were eyeball to each other. And the port is Agadir, where they were positioned, and this truly showed that negotiations have totally failed. There is a lot of trust deficit, and all the empires are moving at the expense of each other, which made the war imminent. That will be proven right in just 3 years. And the British, uh, being a patron to the peace when it comes to the colonies, it was tested, and this is something very important, that the alliances were now totally on the ground. Their support to for Germans, it was a clear wake-up call, because to France, British and Russian they came as a support militarily, diplomatically, while when it comes to Germany, their choice of allies was to Hungary, and the Ottomans they were no match, and for that it was then settled through uh, French controlling Morocco, while the Cameroon that was under the influence of Germany but challenged by France, it was conceded. However, this showed that how the war will proceed, because the system of alliances they were in place. Uh, what makes this episode as one of the precursor or the roadmap to the First World War was the military outcome was pretty clear. If Italy invades Libya, which was under Ottoman rule, there was no match. Although Ottomans offered before the war commenced a peaceful transition with a limited authority of the Ottoman Empire, the same which was agreed in case of Egypt and Suez Canal with the Britishers, but Italy was absolutely for war. However, this defeat is significant because after losing this, the chain of events in Balkans got inspired, and that brought earthquake, which was what was witnessed by 1914. So that was the collapse that was happening. As reflected earlier, the loss at Libya, it started a trigger reaction, domino reaction in Balkans. So there were two wars. You can see from the map the way only in 2 years the Ottomans' entire control of the region was gone. It was nowhere on the map anymore. And in the first phase, it was Greece, Serbia, Montenegro, and Bulgaria, which got independent. And the second is less towards the Ottoman but inter rivalry, and it was where the Serbians, they somehow outpaced its earlier partners, and it was an inter-war, and Serbia emerged as a very significant power. And this newly found place of Serbia unsettled Austro-Hungary, and Serbians and Russian joined hands owing to their Slavs background, their inroad into regions which were controlled by Austro-Hungary, specifically Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908, and their claim became more firm and Austria became more insecure. Making the last on my list, although in most of the history session this will be the first and foremost, is Gavrilo Princip. This man, he is the last fuse, not the long fuse, the last fuse. Very, very interesting character. We will cover it up in great detail. That's the fateful pistol, most costliest shot ever heard, that killed Archduke and Sophie. And this man was hardly 20 years old when he did something, while just a year back he was declined to fight against Ottomans for Serbia of being too weak physically, but no one knew what was written in his destiny to start a war. By all means, we will discuss his entire background, but just to add, Serbian uh, proxy called a Black Hand, and it had clearly links with its military intelligence. It provided him with a weapon, and the reason was to unsettle the Austro-Hungarian influence over the Slav region and get them part of the Serbians. And by all means, I understand this was their understanding. No one was aware that how this one event will bring into test all the alliances. In the effect of single bullet fire from this Browning at Sarajevo will resonate to entire corners of the world. And to some, he's a hero, but he was put on trial as it was the Austro-Hungary area, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But merely 4 years after this event, he, owing to poor conditions in the prison, died of tuberculosis. We will discuss him in a great length in the Black Hand episode, but for the time being, that's it for you, Gavrilo Princip.